Fate. Souls and Singularities Chapter 120–121. Those who speak the language of the trees. The carriage continued to trundle along in the direction of the settlement. As they grew closer and closer to it, the occupants could clearly make out more discerning features regarding its design and manner of protection. Tarkus stuck his head out of the window, briefly causing the others to shiver as they were blasted with cold air from the outside. "I can see the town," he called back as his gaze switched between the interior and the exterior. "What can you see?" Olga asked as she hunched herself closer and pulled up her thermal mask to keep some warmth about her. "It looks like," Tarkus' head leaned forward slightly, the man likely trying to squint. "It looks like trees, Miss Olga." A pause as the knight gave a thoughtful hum. "Maybe a bramble bush?" The director regarded him with a raised eyebrow as she tilted her head. "You mean that Ribe is surrounded with plants?" "Yes." The knight nodded his head. "It's very tall, Miss Olga." He leaned back into the carriage and closed the window. "I wonder how they managed to grow all those bushes," he asked aloud as he looked up. "Actually, if all the forests around here were burned down, then how did they avoid it?" "A conundrum." Nero hummed, crossing her legs over one another and cupping her chin. I believe that the air-headed man speculated that the town was protected with some manner of spell, no?" Olga drummed her fingers on her arm. That was likely the answer, which meant they would likely be dealing with some manner of caster-class servant who held dominion over fauna-based spells. Likely working up some sort of spell to protect the entire town while also keeping their position hidden as best they could. This lent more credence to the speculation that they were instead dealing with some manner of final bastion to defend against an outbreak of something as opposed to the ones responsible. However, she couldn't be certain of that. "So you can get spells to grow plants?" Tarkus asked, sounding rather impressed by the reveal. "Wow." He spoke in an odd tone as he turned back to the window and gazed out across the landscape towards the growing shape of their destination, magic plants. "When we arrive, I shall engage with whomever is in charge," Olga announced, prompting the other servants in the carriage to stare at her and for Romani's face to flash up. "Is that wise, Director?" he asked in a slow tone of voice. When she turned to him, he raised his hands to placate her. "What I mean is that we don't know what sort of servant we're dealing with here and—" "What is the issue?" she demanded with a frown behind her mask. "When Fujimaru approaches whatever stray servant crosses his line of sight, you remain tellingly silent." She crossed her arms and looked to the side. "If that civilian can manage it without issue, then it is a given that I can do much the same." "Director," Romani winced, reaching up and rubbing his forehead. "Fujimaru-kun has much better compatibility when it comes to be a master than you do," he bluntly stated, prompting the woman to whirl on him. "Not that you don't because you have a servant of your own." He hastily added on. "But, well, given the type of servant you summoned," he trailed off meaningfully. Olga clicked her tongue. "Shut up. The mere fact I can rayshift and was able to summon a servant to begin with is proof that perhaps the system we utilized to determine master-servant compatibility was faulty from the beginning." She turned back to him and stabbed a finger in his direction. "If that magically ignorant child can do it, then so can I." Romani just doubted her from the very beginning. They all thought she was going to do a terrible job of it. That was simply it. That's what he was saying, that she was somehow worse at being a master than someone who hadn't even known what a servant was before coming to Chaldea. Fujimaru hadn't even known of the existence of magecraft before he came to Chaldea. "If you say so, Director." Romani spoke again after a few moments, sounding more resigned than he really should have. "We'll be here if you need us." He raised his hands. "Not to say that you do." He hastily added on before she could perceive it as a slight against her skill. "But just in case." "Why not let me approach them?" Nero asked as she turned to the director and raised an eyebrow before sporting a proud smile. "With my imperial privilege. I can merely give myself the charisma skill and convince them to aid us." There was a pause before the woman pouted and crossed her arms. "In fact, the mere fact I don't possess such a skill to begin with is a travesty. As if there is a single soul who could not be swept away by my words." "Charisma is a skill?" Tarkus asked in surprise as he turned to face the emperor. "I didn't know that," he muttered to himself before shaking his head and nodding to the blonde woman. "I'm sure that you are a very convincing person, Miss Nero." UMU. The emperor beamed and jutted her chin upwards. "Of course I am. Naturally, as the flower of Rome, my beauty is like the gods themselves." Tarkus didn't actually respond that time. Instead, he turned and looked down at his hands for a few moments. The move brought a raised eyebrow from Marie, who looked the Black Knight up and down. Is something the matter? Oh, no, shaking his head. Tarkus injected his voice with cheer once again. It's just that I've never seen any gods, so I don't know how to answer Miss Nero. He responded in an abashed tone. She's very pretty, but all the stories about the gods said they were also. He trailed off, tapping his fingers against his knees. They said the goddess Guinevere was a beauty without equal. What was she the goddess of? Beauty. Marie released a small huff of amusement at that, shaking her head at the man and turning back to see how Nero was responding to the threat of competition. Predictably, the Emperor didn't seem disturbed in the least by the potential threat, rather she looked more excited. I'm sure that if we were to stand side by side, all would see my beauty, the girl boasted, placing a hand over her chest and giving a proud smile before she returned her attention to Olga. What say you, Pale Rose? I can handle negotiations with ease. I'm not going to let a servant speak for me, Olga bluntly replied, not looking towards them and still staring out the carriage. As a master, I should be the one to entreat with them first and foremost. That was what Fujimaru did, and that was what she was going to do. All right then. Nero responded with a nod of the head and leaned back, closing her eyes and thinning her lips. The remainder of the carriage journey was one of complete silence. Torin stared out at the horizon, raising an eyebrow behind his helmet and watching as the wagon that looked as though it had been made from glass approached them. Despite its unusual material, he couldn't actually see the interior of the vehicle, which struck him as rather odd. Presumably it was some sort of magical construct, which meant he was dealing with either a rider or a fellow caster like himself. The fact they were approaching via the open meant they either had little choice in their method of transportation, or they were just overly confident, or ignorant to the current situation. Torin's eyes briefly turned skywards, trying to pick out any sort of silhouetted shapes amidst the storm clouds and allowing a sigh of relief when he didn't discover any. It meant that they weren't likely to be attacked anytime soon. Beyond that, he suspected that his fellow druid would be able to divine an attack before it happened. It would at least give them time to prepare. His eyes returned to the carriage as it twisted and faced him side on at a considerable distance. He didn't make an effort to move or brandish his weapon, content to remain where he was and wait for the new arrivals to approach him. As the crystalline contraption opened up, he watched as 4 figures emerged from it and out into the open. He thinned his lips behind his helmet. Only 2 of them were dressed for the weather they were in, and the 5th servant, that he could sense, was still in spirit form and hanging out behind them. The lead figure, a thin-looking person wearing a large gray coat with white fur lining the hood and some sort of protection for their face, turned in his direction and stared at him. She was flanked by a rather tall knight in pitch-black armor and a greatsword shouldered on his right side. The other 2 were women, and between them, one of them was wearing what looked like a red dress with the front cut out of it, and the other was wearing a short-sleeved shirt with an oversized hat. If they were going to be allies, he would need to get them into some furs. Servant or not, this cold was going to do no one any favors. Olga stared at the hulking figure standing just beyond the periphery of the bramble-like wall. The man, garbled in dark cloth and black fur with an antlered helmet, stared out across to her with his arms crossed. Romani, she brought up her communicator, is that a servant? The doctor was quick to respond, yeah, it is. A beat, and, oh dear. Oh dear? Olga looked at him. What do you mean, oh dear? From the looks of things, they're also a divine spirit. The doctor responded with a wince. Their class is consistent with a caster, but there's a considerably high ranking of divinity about them. Presumably a divine core, although, the man frowned and tilted his head. It's different from the rider in France and Gwyndolin in Chaldea. Different? Olga furrowed her brows at him. Different how? It's just the readings are different. They're, wow, he blinked. It's weaker than the divine core that Gwyndolin has, but stronger than the divine core that the rider had, so, it's strange. There was a pause. I'd recommend caution. Obviously. Olga snapped at him. They're a divine spirit in Denmark and their appearance seems very Scandinavian. She turned back and shifted. Is it? Could it be a local divine spirit? I don't know. Romani admitted with a shrug. You'd have to meet them, but the fact they haven't started attacking is a good sign. He pointed out with a half-smile. Clicking her tongue at him in annoyance, she turned back to face the servant who hadn't made an effort to move. Closing her eyes and taking in a deep breath, she took a single step forwards into the snow, then another and another. The crunch of snow underneath her boots was akin to gunshot as she approached the servant staring down at her. Even the knowledge she was supported by 4 other servants did little to ease her worries. Especially given what they had dealt with when it came to the power of divine spirits, and if it was a local one, then they would be completely within their element. In effect, they were in the worst possible position. The servant in front of them never once took his eyes off of her. She felt her skin crawl as the ports of the helmet remained locked onto her. A feeling of intense dread flooded through her body as she got closer and closer. Despite that, she managed to keep herself upright and standing. The saber in Fuyuki had been more intimidating than this. Aldrich had been more intimidating than this, so she could do it. She could do this. You're going to get cold if your friends remain dressed like that. It took her a few moments to realize the servant had spoken. Her feet rooted themselves to the ground and she ceased her movements. There was at least 5 meters separating them, and she had commanded Berserker to charge the servant if he made any hostile moves. Before she could open her mouth and respond, Tarkus took the initiative. I said that as well. The Black Knight nodded his head in a sage manner. I don't think they have any warm clothes though, he lamented. Truly? The caster tilted his head ever so slightly, arms still crossed over his chest. One would assume you had planned poorly were it not for the fact that your leader is dressed for this weather. He turned to Olga. Could you not spare your allies some appropriate cloth? Olga's mouth opened and shut repeatedly behind her mask. Barely 5 seconds into dialogue and she was being critiqued by a servant? She felt her irritation rise. I didn't know they were coming. She snapped back at him before she could help it. They just tagged along. So you mean to suggest they stowed away like children? The caster's voice was dubious. Olga felt her irritation rise higher and higher. He spoke again before she could explode on him. However, that is not the most pressing issue for us, is it? His arms uncrossed themselves and fell to his side. I have one question for you. Are you of those who watch the stars? Olga blinked at him incredulously. Was that supposed to be some sort of riddle? Watchers of the stars? Ah, you mean Chaldea? Romani's voice came through her communicator. The man's face flashed up and pointed at the caster before he realized something. Wait, you know about Chaldea? I know of it. The caster admitted with a nod of the head. But that is it. Your existence was all I knew of, as well as the fact you would be likely to arrive. He turned to face Olga. Your arrival was divined several days ago. Someone predicted our arrival? Romani tilted his head ever so slightly, but not you? No, Caster shook his head. My skill does not lie within the gift of seeing. He gestured behind himself to the walls. This is the limit of my craft. Aren't you a divine spirit? Olga blurted out in surprise. Shouldn't you be capable of more? Oh, you know of that? Caster responded in a hint of surprise before he shook his head. No. The god who has lent his aid to me is one of nature, as is fitting for my fate. He pointed at the group. But if you are from this city of Star Watchers, then you are here to lend your aid? We are here to resolve the singularity. Olga confirmed with a nod of the head. Which means we shall require all the information you have. Caster stared at her for a few moments in silence, crossing his arms once again and leveling a pointed look at the director. The woman shifted on the spot as the silence continued to stretch on. After nearly half a minute, Tarkus leaned down towards her and dropped his voice as quiet as he could. Which, for him, hardly made any difference at all. I think he wants you to say please, Miss Olga. The knight advised her. Mother always said that manners were important when meeting new people. Olga blinked once, then slowly turned her head towards Tarkus and all but glared at him behind her goggles. The knight, despite not being able to see her eyes, felt the burning glare directed at him and quickly retreated, lowering his head and taking a step backwards and resuming his casual interest in the falling snow. Caster watched the display in silence. There is a lot that can be said for a leader by how they treat their subordinates. The man spoke out towards her in a tone that sounded exceedingly disappointed. And the knight was not incorrect. We are currently 2 groups that have no knowledge of one another, and you are to make demands so readily? He shook his head slowly. There must be a fair exchange made. Olga bristled at the haggling. Before she could open her mouth, Nero decided to jump in. You will provide us with the knowledge we seek, and in exchange we will provide you with something of equal value? She surmised with a nod of the head. I see. That is how it should be beneath the ethereal oak. Caster confirmed. I offer my word that I shall be truthful, but I would advise you to make a decision swiftly. Olga narrowed her eyes. Why? Though the clouds might conceal it, the sun is setting swiftly and the nights here are dark and full of a great many terrors. The caster warned them in a grim tone. Should you venture forth without any knowledge of what you will encounter, I have little doubt you will not survive the night." Marie tilted her head in him and gave him an apprehensive look. "You sound confident in that, having only just met us." "I know what it is that stalks the skies here," Castor revealed, then turned to the director once again. "This is my exchange. I shall inform you of your foe and in return you shall aid me." The director frowned, crossing her arms. "We get information and you suddenly get our aid? How is that fair?" "Because it aids you as well. Your timing is both fortuitous and dire." His voice shifted into a more apologetic one, "And for that, you have my sincerest apologies. It is merely that there is little choice." "This is extortion," Olga bluntly surmised with irritation in her voice as she clenched her hands, "not an exchange." Castor's posture shifted subtly, but the pressure being exuded by the horned servant rocketed upwards. "This is as fair an exchange as I can manage. You are free to leave and ignore my warnings, but doing so is akin to suicide. We both fight the same foe and I offer an alliance." He paused before he uncrossed his arms, "but the choice remains yours." The director grit her teeth behind her mask, her hands clenched into fists and trembled at her sides. "Fine," she snapped, "what do you want?" The aura of the caster subsided. "Not as unreasonable as I thought," he muttered in a quiet voice to himself before he continued on, turning around and gesturing to the town behind them. "This has served as a safe haven for some time, but it will not suffice for long. Our foe will be upon us by the end of the day, perhaps the next morning if the storm works to our favor, but either way, it shall be upon us." Tarkus raised his hand. "Do you need our help to fight, Mr. Castor?" Castor let out a self-depreciating bark of laughter. "Much as I wish that were the case, no, I need your aid in retreating," he replied truthfully as his hands dropped to his side. "While myself and my other ally might deal with the serpent babes, we cannot contend with their leader, or his kin." Olga frowned, crossing her arms at the servant and inclining her head to the side. "If you admit to being too weak to aid us against the orchestrator of the Singularity, then why would we even bother in teaming up with?" "What she means to say is," Marie stepped in front of the director, cutting her off with a strained expression and raising her hands in a placating manner, "is what you can tell us about this foe, just to give us some small measure of indication." The locals refer to them as Fafnir. Marie blinked several times before she lowered her hands to her side. Her expression fell ever so slightly. "Oh, the dragon?" "The black dragon, yes." Castor nodded his head, then looked past her to the director. "But he is not alone, and while I have had little personal confirmation, the first few survivors who escaped from the north of the country had a great manner of worrying tales to tell." A paused. "However, if you feel as though you have sufficient knowledge on your own, then you are free to wander through the lands by yourself." He gestured with his free hand to the snowy expanse. "And I shall bid you farewell and assume to never see you again." Olga grit her teeth behind her lips, placing her hands on her hips and tightening her grip as hard as she could through her gloves. "TCH." Clicking her tongue, she looked down and shook her head. "Fine, fine," then looked back up and pointed at the servant. "But I expect you to reveal your true name before we go any further." Castor stared at her, "And in return, your companions will provide me with their own names?" There was a pause as his head moved past them and towards the empty space some meters to their left, including that of your invisible companion. "Their lack of appearance since our conversation began speaks of a great deal of distrust on your part," he pointed out as he shifted his attention back to the woman. Olga scoffed at him. "You think I'm going to take you at your word just like that? I'm not nearly stupid enough for that." She crossed her arms once again. "And the handing over of true names on our part will only occur if we are confirmed to be allies." The caster shook his head slowly at her. "Your bargaining posture is highly dubious. You make demands from a seat of authority that you do not possess." He sighed. "I can see that you're—" The servant stopped speaking, humming to himself before he decided not to speak further on the topic. "But very well, perhaps I might alleviate some of that distrust, not that I suspect you will have heard of me." He straightened himself out. "I am Torin, chief druid of the Millwood Forest, guardian of the ethereal oak." Olga narrowed her eyes. "And the divine spirit?" "I am a pseudo-servant." He explained simply enough. "The Lightkin is not one from my homeland, nor did he come from Lordran. Even I do not know their true name, only that they hold a great deal of love for the woodlands, much like myself." He gestured towards them. "I have extended the hand of good faith to you now. Should you slap it away, I will tolerate no further dealings and you shall be left to fend for yourself against the Black Serpent and his kin of scale and fire." The group remained silent as his words hung in the air. The director was still as she engaged in a staring contest with the caster. Torin. And he held her gaze without so much as flinching. Eventually, the pragmatic need for information won out over the potential delay and whatever else she might say. If they were dealing with Fafnir once again, then they would need every servant they could get their hands on. At least to thin out the horde. Stahl was a dragon slayer, so she could just use them against Fafnir in the end, but it was whether there were other hostile servants present. In France, it had been Fafnir led by a summoned version of Jeanne d'Arc and her own band of servants. They were fortunate that Siegfried had been summoned at the time. And it was nearing the end of the 8th century, meaning if Siegfried was summoned then he wouldn't benefit from any sort of reputation boost. Not discounting any other dragon slayers being summoned, and they had no way of knowing if this caster was a dragon slayer himself. That and this pseudo-servant claim warranted further investigation. Very well. She straightened herself out. You will provide us with the information we require and then we will aid you in leading these people to safety. They were still here to protect history and it wouldn't do to have the Norse population wiped out so early into their history. She didn't even know if the Viking Age had come about yet. You bask under the tree of wisdom for now, it seems. Torin murmured to himself. Olga bit back a retort asking what that was supposed to mean. The caster turned around and brought forth a large two-handed two-sided axe. The weapon looked as though it was crafted from pure bronze by the dull material it held. O tree, Sindu Sloina. He chanted out as he slammed the base of his weapon into the snow with a gentle crunch. There was a silence before the walls started to shift. The interlocking branches slowly started to uncoil themselves from one another and retract, opening up a path into the town itself. Torin didn't bother to see their reactions as he walked into the settlement, calling out at the top of his lungs, Brynjar, we have visitors. Aaron, find some furs for our lesser clothes guests, they will need it. Furs? Nero parroted behind the director with a puzzled tone of voice. Looking down at herself, why would anyone wish to cover this luscious sight? She shook her head in disbelief before looking back up. Unless I might get them fashioned into a cape, she realized, cupping her chin and humming to herself. Would that work? I'm not sure. Marie offered honestly before she smiled, but I'm certain you'll look fabulous in it. She shivered slightly. On another note, I would be more than grateful for something warm to wrap around myself. Worry about it later. Olga bluntly commented as she started to walk forwards. Tarkus waddled up to fall into step at her side. The two of them were the first to pass through the periphery of the wall and into the settlement itself. Olga thinned her lips as her eyes scanned their surroundings. She caught sight of nearly everyone looking in their direction and whispering to one another. The town itself was made of thatched huts and the odd wooden home, although she could see traces of scorch marks lining the roof of several houses closer to the wall. Her eyes narrowed slightly. So that was why he warned them. Their scrying was no longer an effective camouflage if they had been found. Her eyes shifted towards the walls and she almost did a double take, staring at them in surprise before she stepped closer to them and found her attention drawn to the glowing symbols carved into the bark. Runes, she muttered to herself. It made sense. The caster had outed himself as a chief druid with a divine spirit, but these were like the caster of Fuyuki's runes, which meant they were primordial. You recognize them, do you? She jolted, whirling around and seeing Torin staring at her from a short distance with his arms by his side. They are not my work, before you ask. At best, I can beseech the trees for aid. Olga narrowed her eyes at the wording. Beseech? I speak the language of the ethereal oak. Torin replied with a prideful tone in his voice. The language is known only to the highest of our sect, though to discover it is rather common here was mildly disconcerting, but I shall not let it damper my spirits. He went on with, turning around and waving his hand forwards, come, while your odd transportation might be swift I doubt it keeps you warm. There is a fire going in the main lodge and the Volva. He paused, sighing to himself, that is a slur isn't it? Shaking his head he continued on, the cider has been waiting for you for some time. Olga narrowed her eyes. Cider? He is a fellow druid but his craft and mine are as different as the stars and the moon. Torin joked with a shake of the head as he moved through the street. Approaching the reasonably large hall at the far end of the settlement, twin wooden doors blocked their path and stood a good foot above the caster himself. As Torin approached, he pressed his hands on the wooden doors and pushed them open with ease. The Watchers from the City of Stars have arrived. Cider, Torin announced as he entered, staring across the room towards the man sitting by the fire, his back facing them as he poked at the fire before him with a stick. That right? The man asked in a voice tinged with amusement. About time. I was getting a little bored sitting on my ass all day. Olga paused at the familiar voice and found herself staring at the back of a very familiar sky-blue robe with a white fur around the hood. The man rose up from his seated position in front of the fire and turned to face them, his hands moving up to the hood covering his features and grasping it, pulling it back and exposing his face to the outside world. Bright blue hair flowed down from the top of his head, crimson-slitted eyes locked onto the director, and a sharp grin came to the man's face. Raising a hand, he gave the group a lazy wave of the hand. "Yo. Wah." Olga sputtered before she stabbed a finger at him. "You, but how, when?" "Yikes." Cu Chilane shook his head at her, sporting a wide smirk as he beheld her state. "So stunned for words are you? Don't worry." His smile became more predatory. "I know the effect I have on women." "They can't speak in front of you?" Tarkus asked as he joined the director by her side, staring at the caster and tilting his head. "Because I sometimes do that around pretty women." He paused and looked down at his feet. I actually struggle a bit sometimes." Cu Chilane gave the Black Knight a single blink before he opened his mouth and responded with, "Sounds rough, pal." He paused as he looked him up and down. "You're a big lad, so I'm sure that." He paused and narrowed his eyes. "Wait a moment here." He closed his eyes and sighed. "You're one of those guys, right?" he asked with a resigned tone of voice. "Those guys?" Tarkus responded with a confused tone of voice. "You know," Cu gestured with his hand, "the mortally challenged?" Tarkus regarded him with a silent stare. "The deathly undeparted?" More silence. "Undead," he whispered, making sure none of the other Norsemen could hear them. "Oh." Tarkus made a noise and nodded his head. "Yes. I am a." He spoke in a loud tone before Cu widened his eyes and waved his hands in front of him. "Oi, oi, oi," he cried out. "Keep that to yourself," he warned, throwing a hand around him. "These guys have enough trouble with dragons. They think Draugr are suddenly walking around and they'll be waiting for fucking Surtur and his army of Jotuns to come calling." Tarkus tilted his head. "WH. Never mind." Cu shook his head and turned to the others as they filed into the room, allowing the smile to return. Well. Finally, some nice women to look at." He grinned. "Nothing against the lasses here, but sometimes you just want a girl who can't snap a sword with her gate." "Can't all gates do that?" Tarkus dumbly asked, prompting looks from both Nero and Marie as they understood just how innocent the knight truly was. Depends on the type," Cu responded vaguely before he shrugged his shoulders. "If you're done being brash." Torin chided the group as he closed the doors behind them, shutting them in the room and once again turning to face the room. "We have something to discuss." He walked past the group, pausing as he moved past Cu Chilane. "Beware of the woman," he whispered to his fellow druid. "She has a rather frightful temper." Cu snorted and gave Torin a knowing look. "You don't know the half of it." A shadow moved through the sky, panting and wheezing as it forced what little strength remained in its body to carry it all the way home. It had barely managed to escape with some of the others from the attack, but they had succumbed to their injuries, made infinitely worse by the storm. As long as it could return home, to the nest, then all would be well. The bronze-colored wyvern's eyes dimmed slightly as it started to feel the full effects of the deep slash running across its torso. The wound had already scabbed over, but that didn't change the fact bones had been shattered and organs had been damaged. As sturdy as their kind were, they had their limits. As it closed in on the distant shape, a towering tree stretched high into the sky. The shape akin to one of stone, moving past the clouds and touching the heavens. Hundreds of shapes moved around it, of all shapes and sizes and all manner of differing colors, all of which were wyverns like themselves, and along with the occasional dragon to accompany them. Their larger cousins dwarfed them but remained closer to the ground, not as content to circle the great tree as their kin. The bronze wyvern moved towards the entrance, a large hole carved out in the front of the giant plant. Its strength could no longer support its flight. The wyvern felt its wings give out and its body start to glide through the air as it approached the ground, rapidly picking up speed as it did so with no possible method of slowing down. A blur moved through the sky before it impacted the ground. The wyvern found its momentum halted rather suddenly but not painfully. A pair of huge arms wrapped around its body and shielded it before a deep crunching sound went off. For a few moments the wyvern was left confused before it noticed the deep cracks spreading across the surface of the ground, realizing that what had caught it had clearly taken the impact for them. "Such deep wounds, little brother." The one holding it spoke in a growling voice as they lowered the small dragon kind to the ground, lying the reptile on their side. The shadow loomed over them, Elongated head scanned their form before slowly turning skywards. And you return without your kin. This means you encountered equals. The wyvern released a soft growl. Where? The head turned down to them once again. Where did you meet them? The bronze wyvern slowly looked up to the shadowed figure before it growled once again. The figure nodded their head in response and slowly backed away from the wyvern as consciousness left it. So, further south, is it? The voice muttered again before it shifted into one of finality. I wonder, is that where the one of the crystal knives escaped, or are there more? A silence stretched on before the figure shook their head and turned around. Sister, see to it that this young one is healed. A deep rumble sounded out from further within the cave. Two hazel-colored orbs shone through the darkness and stared back at the smaller figure. Naturally. The voice responded, as if in complete contradiction. This one sounded much gentler and distinctly feminine. They are my child after all. The dark shadow nodded once, then turned away and towards the figure stood not far from them. Shall I depart to investigate this, or do you wish to do so instead, sister? The black armored knight shifted in their mounted position. The black horse beneath them snorted once. Horned helmet turned in the direction of the speaker. An authoritative voice sounded out from behind the helm. Very well. I shall deal with this myself. Their voice was cold as the icy fields that surrounded them. The horse trotted forwards. If they are the ones my spear has been summoned to destroy, then so be it. They shall either be crushed beneath me or they shall best me. The first figure stared at the rider for a few moments in silence before nodding their head. As you say. Take some of your kin with you. The rider paused. If you say so. A large scaled hand raised itself into the air. The sharpened maw opened wide and a guttural roar echoed out from the throat of the first figure. A dozen wyverns answered the call as well as a singular dull red dragon. The larger beast rose its head up from its position lying down on the snowy embankment and slowly spread its wings wide on either side, pushing itself off the ground and taking off into the air. The dark armored knight cracked the reins of their horse. The beast let out a cry of acknowledgement before it charged forwards. The pair of them galloping through the snow and closely followed by the detachment of wyverns and singular dragon. The tall figure watched them depart, slowly bringing their arms over their chest and crossing them. I wonder why she speaks so strangely to me sometimes. A snort echoed out from behind him. She is a servant and expects you to act like a master. Master? A pause? What does that word even mean? So let me confirm something. Romani started the discussion, his hologram appearing in front of the group and facing the direction of Cu Chilane. The way you spoke when the director first arrived indicated that you have some memory of us, right? There was a pause. But we've already got a version of you summoned to Chaldea who appears to have the same set of memories. Confusing, right? Cu merely replied in the form of a grunt. His expression turned thoughtful. Let's see, for me, it's like being told about something that I did rather than experiencing. For example, I know for a fact that we met in some burning city. He nodded at the group. But I've never experienced any of that personally. Just think of me as a little different from the Lancer me that you know. There was a pause before the caster made a face. Lucky asshole. Cider. Torin chided from the side of the room, kneeling in front of a small tree and staring at it. Right. Cu waved him off before he turned back to Romani. So yeah, I know things. Like how I know you're a gutless coward. Romani deadpanned at the caster. And I know that you've got a temper about you. He smirked at the director. The woman bristled and scowled at him, earning a chuckle from the caster. But I also more or less know why you're here as well, considering that these guys really shouldn't be putting up with this sort of thing. And what sort of thing is that? Olga bluntly asked, narrowing her eyes and crossing her arms. From the damage we have seen outside, it appears to be a strong indicator for the presence of wyverns, and the locals have already spoken of Fafnir. They ain't wrong. Cu affirmed with a grim nod of the head. We got dragons aplenty here. He paused, and I do mean those on top of wyverns as well. Olga blinked several times, failing to comprehend what he said. Huh? Dragons. Cu reiterated, big lizards, breathfire and kick up a ridiculous amount of magical energy just by existing. Those guys. He frowned, shooting a side glance to Torin. We've been able to keep away the wyverns for a while and we managed to kill a single dragon. You killed it. Torin corrected, I merely distracted it. Sure, whatever. Cu waved his hand. We killed it. But there's more out there. How many more? I don't have a clue, but they all came from way up north. He gestured with his thumb. Had some flee down to us speaking of their settlements being flamed out of existence, and there was one guy before he died who was ranting about a black dragon. The Norsemen call it Fafnir. Torin spoke up from the side, once again taking control of the conversation. The black dragon slain by the hero Sigurd. There was a pause. At least, that was what one of the escapees said before he passed. The druid gave a long sigh. As it stands, there is little information we truly have available to us, as many of the survivors from the northern burnings are still wounded and yet awake. Romani raised an eyebrow. Northern burning? I was already here for that. Siyu waved his hand, then sighed. Yeah. Big black cloud spread down from the north. Then it rained ash for several days. He nodded in the direction of the door behind them. Leaves little to the imagination of what happened, so I'd wager that the dragons are roosted up north. Marie frowned. Would there not be a dragon slayer also summoned? She asked as she looked around. There were 2 summoned in France, and from what you described, this is a much more dire situation that might warrant more. If there are any, they never made it south. Torin grimly commented, gesturing to himself. I might have some meager advantage over the sky serpents, but I am no slayer of drakes and their kin. It was difficult enough to contend with a dragon here with just myself and Cider. Yeah. Siyu nodded his head, then tilted it. I take it that he's told you about what we're asking. You want help to lead the citizens of this settlement south because you're worried an attack might come? Romani ventured. Will. Siyu corrected him. A couple of wyverns escaped the last attack, so they'll be heading back home. Probably going to Growl of Chunter or whatever those things do to speak with one another. He gave an empty laugh. So we're gonna have to get ready to be gone, roundabout now. Olga shook herself from her stupor and stared at the caster. And in exchange? Once this lot is safe from harm, same deal that other me made you in that burning city. Siyu responded with a half smile. You help me, I help you. As will I, Torin added from the side, reluctant though I might be to abandon these men. It would not do well to abandon the greater goal here, and he trailed off for a few moments, his eyes sweeping over the group and his arms still crossed over his chest. It would appear, you're the only aid I shall receive. Olga made an irritated face at the caster for his backhanded remark towards them. It wasn't like he was any better right now. What they actually needed were more dragon slayers, and he had all but admitted to being only marginally better than the average servant. At least Siyu Chalain knew primordial runes, so could at least pull his weight as a caster-class servant. She didn't know what this one could do in the least. The fact he had admitted to being weaker in terms of magical skill to the Irish servant was also proof that he was marginally less useful, although his preference for a large axe seemed to place him as one of those strange servants. Like the annoying archer who used swords instead of a bow. Torin rose to his feet, looking down at the group in silence for a few seconds before he shifted his attention to Siyu Chalain. You have had dealings with them before, it seems. I shall leave this to you. I will see to it that the people are ready to depart within the hour. He moved past them, striding out of the room and back into the cold without another word to them in the least. Siyu breathed out between his teeth and shook his head. He's a straight and narrow one, him. He nodded in the direction of the door as he returned his attention to the director. But he ain't wrong. Let's face it, lass, with dragons about you're gonna need all the help you can get. He chuckled. Guess it's just something about you and me and having no choice in the matter, right? Olga clicked her tongue, glaring at the fire for a few seconds. How long do you suppose a journey to safety would last? Siyu thinned his lips. We'd have to send them off ahead anyway, he remarked with closed eyes. We'll be leaving tracks for the dragons once we leave, so we'd have to double back. He nodded up. And this storm ain't doing us any favors on covering our tracks, trust me. Marie blinked. Why not? She tilted her head to the side. Shouldn't the snow fill in all the footsteps? Siyu snorted. Not those kinds of tracks. He reached up with his left hand and tapped his nose twice. This sort. We're all gonna stink something fierce out there, and the noses of wyverns are bad enough. Nose of a dragon. He whistled. Yeah, miles for that lot. Olga narrowed her eyes at the caster. That just sounds like walking us into a battle to distract the pursuers. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. Siyu confirmed uncaringly. We need to be slaying dragons anyway, and the way I see it, they ain't gonna be sending too big a force to this place. He paused before he winced. Unless they do, in which case, he shrugged. Meh. I'm told we fought King Arthur in Fuyuki and won, so how much worse can it get? Romani gave an exaggerated sigh. If Fujimaru-kun were to hear you saying that. He shook his head before he paused and looked back towards Siyu. Oh, the caster said he was a pseudo-servant. What does that mean? MMMH, CU blinked at him before he shrugged, nothing all that special. He explained, some god has just decided to lend him their power and not outright possess him. Romani blinked. Possess? Yeah. CU nodded. Divine spirit manifested in the same class as a servant. He reached up and scratched his chin. Basically nothing much beyond that. You get a couple new tricks, but having some god saddled up in your head sounds like more trouble than it's worth. A divine spirit lending their power. Romani trailed off, cupping his chin, using a host to wield it. That sounds like a demi-servant? Olga surmised with a frown before she shook her head. No, they called themselves a pseudo-servant? Romani shrugged. I don't understand it either, Director. He paused for a few moments as he contemplated his next sentence. We could always ask the caster about it directly if it matters so much. Olga internally debated it for a few moments before shaking her head. A later time. She decided as she rose to her feet and stared down at CU. If we're going to be helping move these people to a safer location, then speed is of the essence? She inquired with a raised eyebrow. At the caster's nod she continued onwards. Good. The sooner we get them away from here, then the sooner we can resolve this singularity. Sure, one way to look at it I suppose. CU admitted with a lazy wave of his hand. So how long is the other guy gonna keep in spirit form? He smirked. Are they shy? Ah, you mean stall? Nero spoke with absolutely not restraint as she looked up at the height of the ceiling and gave a thoughtful hum. I am not sure if they would fit, unless, how high is the ceiling of this shabby abode? CU blinked once. Well shit, never mind then. He grumbled as he got to his feet and rolled his shoulders. So let's go get everyone ready to move. He paused for a moment. Bring out Tiny as well. I will decide what my servant does and does not do. Olga snapped at him, earning a raised eyebrow from the caster. If the caster appeared taken aback by her attitude, he didn't much show it beyond a roll of his eyes. Well, whatever, this is sort of an all-hands-on-deck situation, and weren't you the one talking about speed being of the essence? She had said that, hadn't she? Cursed this servant for using her own words against her. Fine. Olga turned on her heel and made for the doors, placing her hands on them and pulling them open with a grunt of exertion. Her eyes fell upon the people of the settlement already rushing around trying to prepare themselves for departure. Then noticed a slightly younger man with a rough-cut beard and long blonde hair moving towards them with his arms carrying a bundle of furs. He slid to a halt and instantly his eyes fell upon Nero and Marie with nothing shy of bewilderment. I thought the Jarl jested when he spoke ill of your cloth. He spoke ill of my dress? Nero looked horrified. How? Has he never laid eyes upon true beauty before? The man didn't respond, although his eyes did wander up and down her form for a few moments in silence before a loud cough brought his attention to Tarkus. The Black Knight stood with his arms crossed and staring at the young Norseman, radiating a pure aura of disapproval before slowly shaking his head at the man. The blonde-haired man paled ever so slightly before he swiftly moved to the knight and held out the furs in front of him. When Tarkus took them into his hands, the young man stumbled away and turned about face, rushing back the way he had come. Yeah, I'd recommend dressing warm. CU commented as he stepped out into the open, gripping his hood and pulling it up. Not that I don't appreciate a show. He smirked at Nero. But if you're gonna be in physical form, you're best to dress warmly, and turning into spirit form around these guys is. He paused then shrugged. They'll probably think you some sort of drogger like the big guy, so, you know, don't. He paused before he stepped forwards. Actually. He raised his hand into the air, manifesting his curved wooden staff before slamming it into the ground. The noise seemingly echoed out across the entire settlement and ground all the hustle to a complete standstill. Good news, everyone. The Allfather has sent us his envoys. He raised the staff and leveled it towards the group. These brave shield maidens and their warrior guard will lead us all to safety. Dead silence followed in the wake of his announcement. Olga couldn't help but gape at the caster with sheer horror at him using the name of Odin so casually. Then the people started to cheer loudly, as if a second wind had been breathed into them, and their pace doubled. You, Olga sputtered as her shock swiftly gave way to terrified anger. What are you even? How can you? Why would you? These guys don't need to know about servants and all that. CU explained as he closed the distance with her and dropped his voice into a whisper. And it also avoids a lot of the guys trying their luck with you. The last guy to try and lay with a Valkyrie was Sigurd, and everyone knows how he ended up. He winked at the director. Trust me, lass, I'm something of an authority when it comes to sleeping with the wrong people. But, Mr. Chillane. Tarkus tilted his head. The man paused and turned towards the Black Knight with an intrigued look. Should we really be lying about that sort of thing? He asked, his voice shifting to be more concerned. Because, I don't want to make the gods man. CU snorted at him and pointed, smart lad. As for the first part, we're here to save his people. He pointed out with a shrug. We're basically doing his dirty work for him. Way I see it, Allfather probably wouldn't mind in the least, so we're his envoys on a technicality. Oh, okay. Tarkus nodded his head, accepting the reasoning fairly easily before he turned towards Nero and Marie. Oh, you two need to take these to dress up warm. Nero frowned, hesitantly reaching out and grasping the top fur cloak and pulling it upwards. It was a patchwork of multiple cuts of fur, some dark brown and some pure black. The actual cloak itself was around the Emperor's height, likely made for someone who stood around the height of Tarkus instead of her. Well, Nero made a face at it. I suppose I should admire the gall that a person would have to wear something such as this, but on me it is. Put on the damn cloak and stop complaining. Olga snapped as she turned around to face the two of them glowering at the pair. Nero pouted at her before she slipped on the cloak, wrapping it around herself and frowning as it soon covered her entire body and stretched down to the ground, effectively making her look like a large furry bush with a head jutting from the top. Not that Marie was any better, however hers was more coordinated in its color scheme of hazel fur. The French queen allowed a smile to come to her face as she gripped the inside of the cloak and pulled it close towards herself, a pleased hum emanating from her. This is rather warm. She turned to CU and gave him a knowing look. I can see why you wear something like this. CU blinked once. Actually, it's just sort of a uniform, he bluntly stated before he gave her an odd look. Could you imagine me wearing the outfit of my Lancer self while being a druid? That's a good point. Romani's face popped back up, turning to the caster. Where do you even get spandex in Ulster Cycle, Ireland? I don't answer questions from weaklings. CU waved his hand at him and started to walk away. Do some heavy lifting and maybe I'll tell you. I think it's a very good question. Romani mumbled to himself in a defeated tone, crossing his arms and looking away to the side. It also doesn't matter in the least. Olga bluntly reminded him with an annoyed scowl before she sighed and turned around to face her servants. Help them where they needed, but don't give away your true names and make sure they don't slow down. We're already losing enough time being here rather than chasing down whoever is behind this singularity. Fafnir. Tarkus raised his hand, thinking the director had forgotten. Someone had to have summoned them. She exhaled in annoyance, and they likely did so with the Holy Grail. We deal with them and we restore history to the way it should be. Okay. Olga watched as the servants shuffled off, however she kept stalled close to her and in spirit form. She wasn't going to leave herself alone without some form of protection against actual Vikings. She doubted even Fujimaru would do something that stupid. And Torin, Millwood Knight. Cool guy. And hello again, CU Chillane caster. Welcome to Scandinavia, but anyway, stats, Torin, Millwood Chieftain. Servant. Caster Strength. B+ Endurance. B Agility, C. Mana. C Luck. B Noble Phantasm. C Chieftain of the Ethereal Oak. C Anti-Unit. Max Target. 5. Max Range. 1 to 5. Commanding the trees to his side. He can manifest a spiritual tree to his aid to ensnare his opponents within its branches. Class Skills Magic Resistance. C Item Construction, D. He can craft low power weapons with minor influence over the ground, however they aren't particularly powerful. Territory Creation. E. C. He was a chieftain of the spirit forests and guardian of the ethereal oak, however with the forest destroyed, he no longer has anything he can call a territory. However, the rank would rise if he were within a spiritual forest. Divine Core of a God. C. For the time being, Torin refers to them as a nature god. Personal Skills. Druid of the Forest. B. Torin is a Millwood druid, as such he has advantages within woodlands. Can also command the trees with some great success. Formation of familiar contracts with animals is also much easier. Shaker of the Earth. B. His heavy bronze axe, it can command the earth around him to create short-range destruction. Millwood Chieftain. B+ can boost his strength stat briefly. Foe of the Black Dragon. C. While he is no dragon slayer, he is a foe of the Black Dragon that razed the forest to the ground. While battling dragon types, he has some minor advantage that at least recognizes him as a threat beyond the average one. Summoning, I am Torin, chieftain of the Millwood Knights and druid of the forest. I have manifested with the aid of a god to assist you. Let us protect the green together. Dialogue 1. Man is just as much a part of nature as the plants and animals are. Though we might split from it, we must never forget our roots. Dialogue 2. I wonder, you say you have sunflowers and greenhouses? What aid would they serve you in? Ah, mere titles, I see. Dialogue 3. I answered your summoning, as did the god who dwells within me. We shall aid you whatever needs done. Dialogue 4. If you have Kella, a great spirit of the forest, to be in the presence of one, though it is almost impossible to admit, I believe they might be stronger than the ethereal oak. I say strength in a physical capacity. There is more than one method of being strong. Dialogue 5. If you have Saint Elizabeth, the garden that I and Lady Elizabeth have been growing is coming along nicely. I must thank you once again for allowing us to create it. Dialogue 6. If you have Artoria Pendragon Altar, this aura, the Abyss Drago, no, you are indeed a black dragon, but I do not recognize you. That spear you hold is also, regardless, I shall thank you to steer clear of me for now. Though it is no fault of your own, I have little love for dragons. Dialogue 7. If you have Seed, there is a boy that sometimes wanders these halls. I rarely see him, but on occasion I spot him. Of simple dress and dull red eyes. There is something about him that I do not approve of, but I cannot discern what it is. Dialogue 8. If you have Vritra, for a dragon to claim to be an avatar of struggle, how horrifying, though that might be a difference between our worlds. However, dragons of calamity and myself are a poor mix, and I doubt I can entreat with her from a point of neutrality. Dialogue 9. If you have, do not ever put us on the same team. Likes, that which I like, the forests, though there have been few chances to enjoy the outdoors in Chaldea. Hates, if I am to be truthful, I am often ill at ease within this place. Chaldea is much too metal for my liking. We druids lived generations in the woodland realms, and that is all I know of normality. Though it is no fault of your own, it is my own preference. Wish for the Holy Grail. I wish to see the forests of Millwood restored to their former glory, and for the ethereal oak to stand tall and strong once again. Bond level 1. We have done well thus far. No, you have done well so far. But remember, I was a leader of men once. Should you ever need advice, I shall provide it for you. Bond level 2. The halls in Chaldea are, if I might make one request. You spoke of a greenhouse. Might you explain such a thing further to me? It sounds to have a great deal of interest in it. Bond level 3. I have investigated the room you have set aside for me. I cannot express my gratitude enough, though I know not what will occur when I depart this place. I hope that small corner of Chaldea is blessed by the spirits of the forest. Bond level 4. You wish to join me in tending to the garden? I can allow such a thing. I will ask that you tread carefully, though. Some of the plants have begun to sprout and I would prefer them not be trampled. Bond level 5. Tips for gardening. I am a druid. I merely commune with the woodland realm, but I can teach you how to understand that which they desire. You must approach the life of the forest as you would approach a close friend. If you give them with care, they shall do much the same to you. Demand too much from them and they will die, much like servants. Birthday. A fine day to you on this blessed occasion. May the branches of the ethereal oak protect you from all harm. During an event. You are aware of that outside as well, are you not? Then I would suggest we depart at once. In truth, I tire of being stuck within the halls of Chaldea. First ascension. So I got a little stronger. Second ascension. This must be the blessing of the ethereal oak at work. Marvelous. Third ascension. To be blessed by both the ethereal oak and a light kin. I know not if I was chosen by fate or mere happenstance, but I shall do my best to fulfill their expectations. Fourth ascension. The name of the divine spirit? I apologize, even if I knew I would not tell you. It is a matter of respect for me. If they wish for you to know their name, then they will introduce themselves to you through me. Until such a time, you can only trust in my word that they will aid you as best they can. And now that I am at full strength, so can I. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. Pack your snowshoes. If Olga had been doubting the caster earlier when he said it was going to get dark quickly, then any doubts she currently had about his words were being suitably washed away. The storm hanging overhead hadn't waned in the least during their short meeting in the central lodge. As she gazed across the settlement, She watched as the people started to load up what little supplies they could carry along with the wounded on the back. There was one issue she was noticing though. There were easily around 200 people living here and they only seemed to have perhaps a dozen horses, if not less than that. "Hey, lass." She jolted from her position at the side, turning her head to the approaching figure of Cu Chilane, the caster waving towards her and getting close enough that she could actually hear him over the storm. Not that the noise was actually so severe. "You've probably noticed, but we ain't exactly suffering from a surplus of mounts." He nodded behind himself in the direction of the growing caravan. Olga gazed over his shoulder, squinting her eyes behind her goggles before she returned her attention to the man and waited for him to elaborate further. "The rider that came with you could make those weird little glass horses, right?" he asked, gesturing with his hand in a vague direction which the director assumed was the general location of the rider servant in question. "Think she can help us out a little? If it can stop you from being slowed down, then fine." She waved her hand dismissively before she frowned. "I am unsure how many she can generate though." "Meh, even one is better than nothing, and it's not like the horses we have are exactly the pictures of health." He snorted hollowly as he shook his head. "Foods have been scarce as is, and it ain't like they can eat fish." That brought another concern to the director. "What of food? Will the horses starve?" "If we had more," Cu shrugged, "probably. Although the further south they head, the more likely they are to stumble across some good eating, so that problem should take care of itself in the long run." He paused for a moment. "Wounded though? That'll be a different issue." Olga raised an eyebrow at him and frowned. "Can't you heal them?" "Hey, I can keep him breathing easily enough, but I ain't made of magical energy here," he replied back with a shake of the head, then paused and raised a single finger. "Not a joke, by the way. I'm using the cheapest combinations I can to keep them alive without worrying about mana cost. I can probably sustain myself for a good week, but don't expect me to be firing off my noble phantasm or something." Olga frowned at him. "Then why not just accept a contract with?" "You, bad idea, lass." Cu shook his head at her, giving her a smile under his hood. "We both got those wild tempers, mine is just a little more restrained than yours." Olga bristled. "You how dare?" She thumped a fist into herself. "I am a master too, you know." Cu raised an eyebrow at her, then looked down at the hand that held her command seals. Even covered by her thick gloves he could still tell where they were. "I know that." He acknowledged with a nod of the head easily enough. "Just shit compatibility is all." He squinted at her. "Actually, it hasn't gotten better in the least. How did you even contract a servant to begin with?" He paused and looked over his shoulder. "It ain't simple-headed knight, is it? He seems the sort to do whatever you say, but, Olga was still glaring at him, raising her hand and stabbing a finger in his direction. "You listen to me, you hoodlum." "Meh, whatever." He shrugged, ignoring whatever the woman was trying to say and turning back around to face her, sporting a wide grin. "So long as you don't freeze up, and your servants aren't weak as shit, then we should be able to stumble our way through this, eh?" He cheered, reaching forwards and slapping her on the shoulder with enough force to stumble her slightly. The director let out a surprised gasp at the sudden push, staggering forwards and struggling to keep her feet on the snowy ground. Cu blinked as a shadow suddenly loomed over him. A large metallic hand reached out and instantly clasped the back of the director's coat and halted her flailing before she could fall. The newly formed titan of a servant gently pulled the woman back and set her gently on the ground, all the while the scale-armored helmet with twin horns jutting horizontally from the side of the head and a frizzled red plume extending from the back seemingly glared down at him. The caster, rather than be off-put, simply stared at the new servant with something akin to fascination as he gave them a once-over. "Ho? You're a big fella, aren't you, bud, He frowned and stepped back, narrowing his eyes behind his hood. "You got this empty sort of feeling to you." Olga patted herself down and sent a rather irritated glare at the caster before it turned into a smug look. She crossed her arms in front of her chest and puffed herself out. "This is the servant I summoned." Cu looked at her, then back at the berserker before he reached up and scratched the back of his hood. "Well, he's certainly got a presence about him." He looked over his shoulder and noticed that several of the passerbys had paused in their work and become aware of the newly appeared servant, their faces slowly turning ashen. Cu waved his hand to placate them, giving the best smile he could beneath his hood. The people let out noises of understanding as they departed, still looking over their shoulder at the servant. "So, this guy," Cu turned back around and stared up at the servant, "really wanted to keep that ace up your sleeve, huh?" I thought the lass with the big hat was kidding when it came to putting him inside the lodge. He smirked. You ain't part giant, are y'all? Stahl stared down at him in silence, not offering anything by way of a response. The lack of a reaction prompted the caster to thin his lips and give the servant a mildly frustrated click of the tongue. You're either an asshole or you're a berserker. He paused, looking the servant up and down before he turned to the director. If it's the latter, guess you must be doing something right to keep one of those guys under your thumb and fairly obedient. There was another pause, unless it's like some kind of haze that makes them obey any sort of order given to them. Olga regarded him with a flat look, lowering her hands to her side and placing them on her hips. Are you just working out ways to not so subtly insult me now? Cu raised his free hand to placate her. Nothing like that, but if we're gonna be working together I gotta know what I'm actually working with. He gestured to the berserker. I'm not gonna ask for their life story or something, but how useful are they actually going to be? They're a dragon slayer. Well shit. That useful then. He cracked a smile at the director before looking up at the berserker. Guess you're gonna get overworked, aren't ya, big guy? Stahl remained silent. Sheesh, still nothing. Giving another sigh. The caster shook his head while turning away from the pair and moving away from them. Well, alright then. Just make sure the big guy does a bit more than stand around and look pretty, especially because they ain't doing that last part terribly well. Olga huffed from her nose, turning to look up at Stahl as they maintained their watch on the retreating caster. Eventually the berserker turned their head back towards the director and stared down at her in silence. The woman gave a long sigh before removing her hands from her hips. Then stalked further into the settlement, the berserker lumbering behind her. As it stood, it would make much more sense to have her servant at least speed up the process by doing the heavy lifting, as it were. The superior strength would allow them to carry much more weight than the horses without having to worry about water and food. Was there some issue with turning her servant into a pack mule? Hardly. It wasn't like they would ever disagree with anything she would say. Torin fastened the sleigh onto the saddle of the horse, adjusting the straps to ensure they were tight but not too tight as to cause the animal discomfort. An irritated beast would make for a poor companion in such troubling times. The man nodded once, then moved around to the front of the animal and rested his hand upon its snout, closing his eyes behind his helmet. Just a few more days of hardship, girl. Then you will have a good rest. He patted the animal twice on the snout when it came a light whine in response, then moved past it while making a gesture to one of the riders to mount the animal. As he advanced further through the caravan, he felt eyes upon him. He ceased his walk and shifted his attention in the direction of the gaze. Finding one of the women who had accompanied the brash leader staring at him in curiosity, it was the pale-haired one with the oversized hat. Quite how it remained on her head without falling off was a mystery to him, but he supposed it was simply going to be one of those things that wouldn't be explained unless it was asked. He could still pass along a warning to her though. His animosity to her leader didn't extend to her. Is there something you have need of me for? He asked, breaking the short silence and looking off to the side to see how progress was getting along. If so, I ask that it be a quick request. There is much to be done and little time to be had. I'll try and be quick. The girl apologized as she advanced, then bowed her head. I'm Marie Antoinette, Queen of France. Torin blinked for a moment as his head returned to her in surprise. The girl flashed him a soft smile as she inclined her head to the side. We did make an agreement to trade our true names, didn't we? That we did. Torin slowly admitted, his own confusion slowly giving way to a small degree of respect in his voice. I see that you, at least, understand the value that words have. Marie made a slight face at the subtle jab towards a certain someone. That is something I would like to talk with you about. If it relates to your leader, then this is hardly a suitable time to air grievances. Torin raised his hand. When the safety of this flock is assured, then we might speak more openly on the topic. However, if you are indeed able to provide counsel to her, then I would urge you do so. He lowered his hand, his voice shifting into a more stern one. If it had not been for the Sidiar's counsel, or your interruption, I have no doubt we would not be here right now. She's new to this. Marie raised her hands to give him a placating gesture. She's not really been commanding servants like this before, and I don't think she's used to commanding in the least. She paused before she gave a thoughtful frown. Or she's watched how people command and is trying to copy it without understanding what leadership is like. Torin inclined his head. And you do? That elicited a sad look from the girl. I'm probably not a good person to comment on what being a good leader is about. I really do love the citizens of France though, but I suppose we just didn't get one another. Unfortunate. Torin exhaled. But such is the fate of kings and queens to be placed on pedestals. He gestured to himself. In truth, I have little respect for royalty. He paused, the title, not those who wear them. He looked past her and further into the settlement as if trying to discover someone, walking closer to the queen as he spoke. In truth, your leader is very much how I always imagined a meeting with a royal would go. Ah. Demands based purely upon their titles rather than a position of mutual understanding. Torin sighed, turning back to the young queen. But if what you say holds truth to it, then I will look upon her actions through the reflection of a different stream. Marie blinked before she giggled. You make a lot of references to the woodlands, don't you? Is that a strange thing for a druid to do? Probably not, but I've never really met a druid before. Marie admitted with a shrug before her expression turned curious. She looked past him and towards the horse he had been tending to. Do you treat them all that way? The animals? Naturally. Torin responded without a second moment of hesitation. They are just as much a subordinate of mine as the men. All require the same needs to be content and work to the benefit of all. Just as beasts need food and water, so too does man. Just as beasts need shelter and respect, so too does man. He gestured to the queen. When put forth as such, is it odd that I would treat the animals with respect? Some are placing their lives in the hands of these horses. Why would I treat them lesser? Marie blinked twice at him before she made a noise. I didn't think about it like that. I doubt you would. Few who do not come from the woodlands do. He sighed, shaking his head and crossing his arms over his chest. To my knowledge, only the pyromancers of the swamp understood our creed just as we understood theirs. His voice shifted into a more nostalgic one. There was once a time when our two groups would attend pilgrimages into the other's land. While the swamp is no home for the druids of the snowy forests, we could appreciate the connection with nature. And the pyromancers? They came to see the ethereal oak and pay respect to it. He explained before his voice turned somber. Well, they used to at least. The grotto was turned to ash and the tree reduced to a dead wood. The abyss dragon destroyed all we cultivated. I'm sorry. There is no need for your condolences. Torin cut her off, shaking his head. It is the way of nature. Just as something is born, then so too must it die. That doesn't mean the end needs to be so tragic. Hey, I suppose that much is also true. Torin admitted with a nod of the head before he turned around. I believe this should mark the end of our conversation. We still have much work to attend to. He paused and turned back to the queen. And I would advise you to find a more secure method of keeping that on your head. He pointed at the hat. Marie blinked, reaching up and touching it. What do you mean? The walls keep out not just the drakes, but the worst of the winds. The moment we pass beyond the walls, we shall be at the mercy of the storm. He elaborated, and I suspect your hat might be lost. Ah, I'll make sure to keep a firm grip on it. Marie replied with an amused smile but still gave the man a thankful nod for his concern. Do you want use of my carriage for some of your wounded as well? Torin paused. The crystal summon, He gave a thoughtful hum, cupping his chin and staring at the queen. Would the pale-haired leader not protest the loss of her personal transport? I think I can convince her. If you believe you can do so, then I will not stop you. He allowed, nodding his head before he raised his hand. But I would not count upon the blooming of trees in winter. Marie made a face at him for a few moments before she shook her head, giving him a faint smile. I will do my best. She paused. Thanks for the warning about my hat, by the way. She added on, her smile shifting to become more gentler. That was very thoughtful of you to say. Even if my words might seem cold, I do wish for us to be allies. Torin explained in an equally soft voice. We are all the same beneath the ethereal oak. There is no reason to act as though we are not, and, as far as first impressions of you. He paused, cupping the helm of his chin and looking the young queen up and down. You do not seem to be quite so bad, but... Marie could already recognize that sort of, but she instead shook her head at him. I know. But I love them all the same. Then I cannot question your resolve. Torin nodded once, and I ask that, for as long as you remain, you see the people of this land as those of your own and treat them as you would yours. If that is possible for you to do. Marie giggled. I will always love France, but that doesn't mean I can't love everyone else. Hey, then I suppose that will be enough. He paused. In truth, I always loved the grotto most of all. I suppose we're both a little selfish with our love, aren't we? Torin barked out a laugh. Just a touch. Tarkus always considered himself a good listener. He might not always understand what people were talking about, but he would always listen to them. That was the important part. If someone wanted to talk about something, then the most important thing was that they wanted someone to listen to what they had to say, else they wouldn't be talking in the first place. That was his approach to discussions. Hence why, even as he was helping to load the injured onto the sleighs, he was responding to Lady Nero's chatterings as best he could. Being active in one task didn't give him cause to be rude. Hence why, when you return to Chaldea, I would like to employ you for your physical prowess. She finished up proposing to him, hands on her hips and fur cape resting on her shoulders with her front dress exposed to the outside air once again. You need my help in moving something at Chaldea, Miss Nero? Tarkus summarized as he gently set down the wounded man and pulled his arms back just a touch and held them about an inch from the injured in case he needed to make any more moves. When he was satisfied that he didn't need to, he let out a relieved sigh and straightened himself out once again and shifted his attention to the Emperor as he resumed his walk back into the tent for the wounded. More than simple moving, Nero dismissed with a shake of the head as she followed after him, falling into step with his side. I suspect there will be a great many tasks that shall come up that will require those of great physical prowess. She gestured him up and down, and you very much seem the sort to be rather skilled on that front. Tarkus gave an abashed giggle as he reached up and scratched the back of his helmet. Well shucks, Miss Nero. That's very nice of you to say. He lowered his arm. Mother always said that I was only ever really good for lifting things around the house. He paused for a moment. She actually told me to be a knight. Truly? Nero blinked before nodding. It seemed she had quite the perspective on her talents. She said I was also good at breaking things. He added on with another embarrassed laugh. Mother wasn't wrong either. Father said the same thing as well. Pushing the door open, he stepped into the small building and faced the closest individual. Hello, Miss Joran. A woman with brilliant red hair turned about to face them, cloaked in thick furs and with a steel-eyed look about her. Another one? Tarkus nodded his head. Sten can walk, don't let him fool you. She gruffly responded, throwing a thumb over her shoulder and gesturing somewhere over into the room before she paused. Her pale lips thinned ever so slightly. Worst are those who came from the northern ones. She nodded further up. You know the way to him. Yes, Miss Joran. Tarkus nodded his head and raised it back up, walking a short distance past her to some of the injured lying upon a few fabric sheets on the ground. The large knight leaned down and grabbed the fabric before folding it over the injured, bundling them up in their furs like some manner of cocoon and then sliding his hands underneath them and raising them up with ease. Careful. Joran called out without actually looking in his direction. She was by the side of another patient pressing a wet cloth to his head to clean the wound. The woman looked over her shoulder and watched Tarkus depart with a hum before she looked back down. There are many injured here? Nero asked, ceasing her walk behind the redhead. Joran paused in her work for a moment and waved her hand. No, most die in battle, thankfully. She responded back with a grunt, shifting her gaze towards the dozen or so that remained alive. Lost a few to injuries. She spoke in a pained tone of voice. Nero hummed along with her. From what the throne had told her of Viking culture, that was basically damning them to hell. You said these came from the northern lands? The emperor asked further. The caster spoke of the burning of the north. Saw, you mean the Jarl. She understood, nodding her head. Yes, black clouds hung above our heads for days after that. Then we got a few riders bringing with them bad tidings. It was not until the new Jarl arrived that we caught sight of what we were to fear. Winged serpents, the kin of Fafnir. Nero hummed to herself as she thought about the words. I believe the cider was the first to arrive? The emissary of the All-Father came at the same time as the Great Burning, then came the Jarl. Did you not have one before his arrival? We did, but Brynjar was not Jarl for long. His father passed in battle and before his time. Therefore as chief he lacked experience. She turned around. Jarl Torin has already made it clear he shall teach Brynjar all he knows and then shall depart once the children of Fafnir and their fellow kin have been slain. Nero remained silent, nodding her head and then turning away and going back out into the cold. While it was still mitigating circumstances, the idea of servants leading the living was still very much a subject that the throne instilled in her was taboo. The dead do not govern the living, although she was personally skeptical as to whether any of those from the alternate world would regard that in any capacity as a command. Given how it seemed the dead did nothing but command the living. The door to the command room opened. Romani strolled back in with a fresh cup of coffee in his hands. The man looked left and right, briefly scanning the command room before he took a sip from the mug in his hands and announced his presence. "Hey, guys. How is it going with the director? They're about halfway done." Munir informed him. "From the looks of things they'll be ready to move within an hour." Also, the caster wasn't kidding when he was talking about that storm. Readings from outside the bounded field are showing that temperatures have dropped further. The doctor frowned as he sat himself down. How much further have they dropped? If they dropped to a level that was harmful to health, then they would need to consider some manner of further protection for the director. The coat she had was supposed to protect her from the worst of it, but consistent exposure to those sorts of temperatures would start to affect her. "Looking at -25 out there." Carrie responded with a shiver of her own. "Not to mention the wind speeds are starting to pick up and all. Looking at 30 miles an hour right outside." Romani grimaced. While that wasn't nearly as bad as it could be, that wasn't exactly good either. Cold as it got in Denmark during the winter months, it wasn't anything nearly as bad as this as he could recall for the region. To say nothing of the winds that might end up making it worse for trying to move through. "There is some silver lining to this," Maxwell remarked from his own position as he turned around. "Wyverns are cold-blooded, so they are going to have to store a lot of their own flames to raise their internal body temperature to a degree where they can actually move." The man leaned back into his chair and crossed his arm. "So this storm works just as much as a cover for the group as it does as an obstacle." Romani blinked at the man in surprise before he nodded his head repeatedly and gave an approving hum. "I guess that is some good news." He grinned, turning towards Carrie. "By the way, how are the readings looking for Fujimaru-kun's group? Any word on them yet?" Judging by Carrie's exhausted sigh, it would seem there wasn't any news yet. "Really?" Romani frowned to himself, turning towards his own screen and setting his mug down before he switched through the screens until he came across the readings for the London team. As always, they were showing green across the board, which meant there really shouldn't be anything for them to worry about. Despite that, Romani couldn't hide this sense of worry. If there was nothing wrong with the readings, then why hadn't they been contacted yet? Simple interference couldn't account for this, as while they couldn't contact them initially from this end, all they would have to do would be to establish a communication link, and then that would be that. Shaking his head, the doctor leaned back into his chair and drummed his fingers on the desk. Eventually, he shook his head and shifted his chair to the side and opened up a tab next to him on the other monitor. "Leo?" His words earned the attention of the others in the room. "Can you try and do something to boost the power of Chaldee's communication signal?" The genius's voice crackled over the monitor a moment later, her face popping up on the screen with a mild look of concern. "Still no word from Fujimaru-kun?" Romani shook his head. That doesn't seem right." The woman cupped her chin, drumming away on it with her fingers before she lowered them. "All right. I'll see what I can do for our communications on this end." She grinned, placing her hands on her hips and giving a prideful smile. "Not like communication is an impossible task, is it? And even if it was," she trailed off meaningfully while giving Romani a knowing look. The doctor responded to her with a simple deadpan expression before he rolled his eyes and looked away from the caster. "You already know how good you are, Leo. You don't need me to dump you with more praise." "Mo," Da Vinci pouted, crossing her arms and shaking her head. "What's the point of doing all of this if I'm not consistently regaled with praise for all my efforts?" "The knowledge that you're helping mankind?" Romani replied with a dry tone of voice. Da Vinci responded with a loud laugh in response. The doctor just sighed to himself and turned off the screen before the woman could actually respond to the question. He had a feeling he didn't actually want to hear her answer to begin with. Still, he could rest a little easier with the knowledge that Da Vinci herself was looking into the communication issue with Fujimaru-kun. In the meantime, Director, he activated the link with the woman in question. "What?" Olga responded quickly, sounding not quite annoyed but very much on edge. The doctor wasn't surprised considering just how far out of her comfort zone she was. "We've been taking more readings of the storm outside of the settlement." The man continued on. "It's getting worse. You're looking at temperatures below -20 and storm winds with no sign of stopping." He paused for a moment before he continued on. "The good news, we think, is that it should slow down any wyverns that might be trying to follow you. Because of the cold winds." Olga surmised easily enough. There was a pause before she spoke again. "What about dragons?" Romani paused, not answering the woman for a few moments as he briefly debated whether or not he should lie to her before he closed his eyes and released a long sigh. "The chances are that if you are pursued by a dragon, Then they won't be affected too greatly by the weather outside. He grimaced and winced. Meaning if you're being chased by an actual dragon, then there's a good chance the storm will actually slow you down to the point where you would be easy targets. That being said, leaving is still the best idea. Romani hastily added on, because there's a chance you should be able to gain some distance and it's better than staying in one spot. He pointed out, because then you'd be dealing with a potential dragon supported by wyverns rather than just a dragon. Olga gave a single nod of the head through the screen, a confident smile coming to her face. And naturally. And we can handle a single dragon easily enough with the dragon slayer we have with us who won't be affected by the cold. She paused before she frowned. What of the people here? Would they even be able to survive the voyage? Romani paused at that. His lips drew themselves into thin lines. I'm not sure. Not very many people could last in a storm like that without appropriate protection. You'd need to see if the casters can do anything for them, otherwise, you will lose some to the storm. Olga was silent for a moment. I see. She then closed the communicator. Oh. Romani winced, reaching up and pinching the bridge of his nose and exhaling. Maybe I should have broken that more gently? Carrie snorted, maybe in such a way that didn't make it seem hopeless. She responded with, before she cupped her chin, still, I thought she would have made some comment about that. Romani shrugged. Who knows? She's probably going to be doing something. Olga moved through the crowds already growing towards the head of the caravan. Navigating it was easy enough considering she was being accompanied by Berserker. The imposing suit of armor made her almost unapproachable even without the fierce scowl on her face. The woman looked left and right, her eyes moving across the crowd in an effort to find the servant in question. She soon caught sight of the distinctive appearance of the antlered helmet jutting from the top of the crowd, easy enough when the owner of the armor stood just above 2 meters tall. Turning in his direction, she soon started to make her way in his direction, intent on catching his attention and alerting him to the main issue. Ensure that all the wounded are covered up and tied together. She could barely hear the conversation as she approached. Torin already midway through speaking with the blonde-haired man from before who almost followed the caster around like a lost child. I will not lose them to this storm. Yes, Jarl. The man nodded his head. What about? He cut himself off, eyes going wide as he looked just past the taller caster and in the direction of the approaching master-servant duo. Although it was the looming form of Stahl closing in on him with deep reverberating steps that seemed to occupy the majority of his attention. Torin noticed the shift in the man, soon looking over his shoulder and staring at the director for a brief moment before his helmet gradually shifted and rose upwards as he gazed up towards the berserker. The caster stared at them for a moment before he turned back to the younger man. Bundle all the weapons we can and have Joran do her best. Remember, no torches. They will just as much light our way as they will light our enemy's way to us. Why yes, Jarl. Brynjar nodded his head, eyes shifting between the two groups rapidly before he took a step back. Will you? I will be fine, Brynjar. Torin assured the man as he slowly turned around to face Olga. The director could already detect a note of exasperation in his voice for a split second before it faded away. I suspect this is a matter of some importance? You can't leave in this storm. Torin stared at her in silence for a moment, then tilted his head. Oh, and where has this come from? Olga stared at him as if he was stupid. Wah, if you try to move people in that weather they're going to die. She snapped at him, then pointed down. If we stay here until it passes then we can at least defend against an attack if one comes. The small serpents cannot move in the cold. Torin pointed out, raising his right hand and pointing skywards towards the darkening heavens. The storm is the best time for our escape, especially under cover of darkness. They will not be able to pursue us and we are not so limited. You're limited by body heat. The director snapped back, gesturing wildly at him. If you go out there in the storm then the people you're trying to save are going to end up freezing to death in the storm before they get very far. Torin raised a single finger towards her. Not out here. He spoke in a slow and commanding tone of voice, looking left and right before he nodded towards the building to their right. The shed where they kept the grain preserves. The man shifted towards it, pushing the door open and stepping inside. The director internally huffed as she followed him in. Stahl stared at the door for a few moments before he ducked down and twisted his body. The edges of the door creaked as it forced the wood to part and allow their huge frame into the building. Even then the berserker was forced to duck down as there simply wasn't enough room for them to stand up in. Torin turned back around, briefly pausing as he stared at the squatting giant before he returned his direction to the director. First point. Do not raise your voice when trying to give me advice. He spoke in a stern tone of voice. It might incur panic that is undue. Second point. This is not a decision I have made lightly. I am aware of the risks involved. You made it before we arrived. Olga pointed out, placing her hands on her hips. You want us to abandon a defensible location and brave the storm to try and get south when there isn't a need to. She gestured to herself. If there is an attack, then we can repel it with the servants we have on hand. I have no guarantee of that. Torin cut her off before she could finish. While I have little doubt the entourage you arrived with would be capable of dealing with a flock of wyverns, they are not all that we face, and to fight any dragon that would arrive would require the efforts of all the servants here. And I have a dragon slayer, singular. Torin once again cut her off, his voice still even, singular dragon slayer. I assume it to be the giant behind you? When the director gave no further response, he nodded his head and took it as acknowledgement. While the giant behind you does indeed seem capable of slaying dragons, and it is more than can be said for me or Cider, that still leaves us with one. I doubt the Queen of France is as capable in the art of dragon slaying. Olga widened her eyes. How did they then narrowed? She told you. We did make an agreement. Do not speak ill of her because she wishes her words to have value. Torin briefly scolded before he continued on. But let us suppose that we remain, and it is not just a meager force that arrives but the Black Dragon of Calamity himself, accompanied by his kin. Do you see a method of victory before us against such odds? The director rolled her jaw but didn't respond, at least for a few moments. Then she spoke up. I'm not saying wait for them to come to us, but you two can't be the only servants in this singularity. And I have every reason to believe you on that front. Torin allowed with a nod of the head. I suspect there are others who exist, but if there are, then they are beyond us for the moment. Likely taking refuge in the other cities to the east and perhaps further south. That is where they would have headed if they cared at all for the people they were summoned to protect. If you take them out south in this storm, then they might end up dead before they even get very far. Do not raise your voice. Torin dropped his own several octaves and raised a single finger in front of her. The woman stared at the digit for a few seconds before she narrowed her eyes at him. Yes. You are right though. Leading the injured into the storm to seek safe haven will undoubtedly lead to some casualties, and that is not something I can help. But I can guarantee there will be fewer than if we remain here. We don't even know there's a force of dragons arriving, the director couldn't help but blurt out, waving her hands at the man. This is all just supposition on your part. Supposition based on logic. Torin shook his head. The sky serpents behave like pack animals, and when a pack member discovers prey, they alert the others. He pointed down. We are very much prey right now. The injured wyverns that escaped us will have flown back to safe haven, and they will inform their packmates what lies here. The director frowned. If they fled and got caught in the storm, then how do you know they aren't dead? She pointed at him. This whole plan is still based on guesswork. Indeed. But if there is even the slightest chance that a single wyvern was able to fly back, then I will take that as an absolute certainty. Torin leaned away from the woman. If we were protected by stronger trees than the saplings that surround us, then perhaps I would chance it, or if we have more specialized dragon slayers, then I would be more willing to as well, but we do not. He pointed to the berserker. Even the arrival of you and your allies brings the grand total of dragon slayers here from none to one. While it is better than nothing, it will still not be able to contend with a full force of wyverns that fall upon us. We cannot defend the people and slay wyverns at the same time. The woman opened her mouth to speak again. Nor can we wait for the storm to break. He spoke before she had a chance to. The woman closed her jaw and stared at him in brief surprise for a moment before her expression shifted into a more annoyed one. Why not? Because the cover of darkness and the storm will keep the wyverns away from us. He explained, then noticed something flash through her eyes. And you know this as well, don't you? It won't stop any dragons that arrive, true, but it will be just dragons. Torin tilted his head. And you were the one who boasted of bringing a dragon slayer. While we spirits handle the dragons, the people have ample opportunity to make distance from our battle. They could not do so if we were attacked by wyverns and dragons, not without splitting our forces up dangerously thin. Torin seemingly looked her up and down before he exhaled. I did not make such decisions on a whim. Much thought went into them, and while your concerns are genuine, they must be put to rest, else we shall all suffer for it. Olga rolled her jaw at the man as she continued to work up some other form of argument before she crossed her arms and looked away in a huff. If that is all you wish to discuss, then we are done here. Torin nodded his head, walking past her but not before pausing by her side. One more thing of note. I am perfectly willing to entertain any suggestions or concerns that you have, but do not dare speak to me with such blatant disrespect ever again. He looked down at her from the corner of his vision, especially not in front of the people of Ribe. With his message delivered, he turned away from her and resumed his exit from the building, stepping around the large berserker and back out into the open, leaving the director behind. The woman clenched her hands into fists. The least he could have done was been unreasonable, so she had something to complain about. As it stood, the only thing she could get mad about was that she hadn't thought of those points instead. Which just went further into her mind about how a mere servant probably thought himself her better. Torin closed the door behind him, then paused as he found the Black Knight that had arrived with the group standing before him. You heard then? Torin grunted as he looked down at the slightly shorter knight. Tarkus nodded once. I see. Torin hummed in response, crossing his arms over his chest. Do you have issue with my words? Tarkus remained silent for a few moments before he shook his head silently. At least you understand that much. The druid grunted once more before he shifted his attention away from the knight and strode further towards the growing caravan. Tarkus watched the man depart, silently staring at the back of the retreating servant before he heard the door in front of him click once again. Turning his head towards it, he watched as the director stepped out of it and back into the chill. The woman briefly paused as she saw the servant standing in front of her. Her expression cycled from surprise to confusion, then finally to something more resigned. What are you doing here? She asked, raising an eyebrow at the knight and looking him up and down. Tarkus shifted in his posture, teetering from side to side as he debated how best to ask the question. Eventually, he mustered up the courage to ask something that he himself wasn't sure how she was going to react to. Miss Marie said that she wanted to ask about using her carriage to transport some of the injured and children. He explained to her, but that would mean we would have to walk through the icy snowstorm and below 20-degree temperatures? The woman replied with a dry voice as her arms crossed over her chest. She stared at the knight for several seconds in silence as his helmet slowly started to shift away from her. Yes, fine, fine, Olga sighed, reaching up and pinching the bridge of her nose and hiding away her expression. We can't have the wounded and children being dragged along behind us. They'd end up slowing us down anyway, and considering we're supposed to be making a swift exit. She looked back up to see Tarkus had perked up considerably. She didn't need X-ray vision or for the knight to remove his helmet to see the wide smile upon his face. He practically radiated pure enthusiasm when he heard her answer. Don't look so pleased, she snapped at him, causing him to flinch slightly. That's just common sense, and if we're going to be doing this, we might as well ensure as few casualties as possible. Okay. Tarkus nodded his head towards her, briefly debating what else he would need to say before he added on, I'll tell Miss Marie the good news, thanks Miss Animosphere. Animosphere. She corrected with a touch of heat in her voice, giving the knight a side-eyed glare for a split second before she turned away from him in a huff. Tarkus remained silent as he nodded his head. All right, he called out to her, sorry. I'll try and remember it from now on. Just call me Master Idiot, she snapped back to him from over her shoulder as she marched away. Tarkus lowered his arm back to his side and remained silent for a moment before he shrugged, I'll get the hang of it. He decided to himself, looking left and right before he wandered back the way he had come, eager to tell Miss Marie the good news regarding her carriage. It was nearly a full 2 hours before they were preparing themselves to be underway. Torin stood at the head of the caravan with a rope tied around his waist. The man passed it to the next person down. Tie this around you and then hand it further down. We can't risk lighting up torches in the storm, and even if we did, the wind would put them out swiftly before they could be of any use. He raised his voice slightly higher. I shall lead up on the path south. If we are attacked, then Cider will alert us with his magics. Or just scream really loud. See you called out, and thrash around if a wyvern grabs hold of you. Going out while fighting a dragon will make for one heck of a story when you end up in Valhalla. That got a few weak chuckles from the group and a dull stare from Torin. Or that. He allowed with a nod of the head. We shall move as far as we can in the storm and then take rest when it breaks. After we are suitably well rested and if I am comfortable there is no sign of further danger, we will renew our journey. Understand? He got a response from the caravan, a legion of affirmations to him which caused him to nod his head and turn to his side and look down at the director. You are free to join your other compatriots. I'm not going to just let someone else carry my weight. The woman cut him off sharply, pointedly ignoring the fact that she was being flanked by Tarkus, who was carrying one of the heaviest loads out of all of them, only beat by Stahl, who, tied to his hips, had several sleighs full of wounded with almost a dozen runes of protection carved into them to safeguard them from the harsh elements. Torin just stared at her in silence before he gave a long sigh and shook his head. The only thing worse than someone who had no experience in leadership trying to lead was someone who had no experience in leadership forcing themselves into terrible situations in an effort to prove that they had the capacity for leadership. Either way, he'd have to keep an eye on her to make sure she didn't make any brash calls. Not just for her own sake, but for the sake of the people he was trying to safeguard. Prepare to move out, Torin called out at the top of his lungs, bringing his axe into existence and waving it over the top of his head in a circular motion several times before he slammed it down into the snow. Turning towards the walls, he extended his hand. Brace for the winds. He warned further, the moment this wall comes down, we shall experience the elements in full. They would be barely able to see as was, and the rope tied around their waists would be just as much their method of movement as it would be a safety line. O tree, Sindu Sloina, he called out. The branches that surrounded their settlement reverberated as the glowing runes around them started to fizzle and sputter. The defensive barrier came down in moments and the walls split apart. The storm fell upon them in an instant. Olga had brought down her goggles and raised her mask, and even with all that she still had to raise her hand to brace herself against the sudden storm force winds that crashed into her. Worse was the accompaniment of the snow, or rather, the ice, that fell upon them in a fury. Torin showed no indication that he so much as registered the sudden shift in climate as he started to move, his head boots rising from the snow and stepping forwards. His left hand fell to the rope at his waist and gripped tightly around it as he started to pull. The sudden jolt in the line encouraged others to follow him along. The caravan had officially begun their trek through the snow and ice. A little later than normal, but I was taking a short holiday break. Back now, so we're resuming operations. For more thrilling fanfiction stories like this, check out my channel Fanfic Audiobook. Dive into epic adventures, mysterious realms, and legendary journeys brought to life through immersive storytelling. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing audiobooks.